today, first I would like to recap some foundation of the theory models why inflation expectation or macro expectation is important for macroeconomics. And I know that you already studied EMD in Moidley, so just quickly recap the knowledge and refresh everyone about the topic, and it also play as a foundation for our integral studies. So the new Keynesian models here is a workhorse of the modern business cycle macro and the system of different equations, the dynamic stochastics and equilibrium models, and it also play as the micro foundations of macroeconomics. And this is very simple models in our course. So the baseline version of the new Keynesian models here based on two kinds of equation with a monopolistic application and sticky price. So it's how the food they can sacrifice compared to the perfect application. That is, they have no power to set the price, but in this model, first they have power to set the price before monopolistic competition and price increase. And the two types of agent, with the multipolicy authority and two agents here is household, firm, and central bank. So that's why in this course we are interested in how households they form expectation and how firms form expectation and make economic decisions. And the role of central banks in this model, how central banks they set interest rates and manage inflation expectation. Okay, so after many relations, the new Keynesian BFC models in its basic version boils down to three equations here: the IS curve, Philip curve, and Taylor rule. And then we know about it. So the IS curve is derived from the household utility maximization problem. And this equation for the IS curve. So the YTQness here is the output gap. But it also can interpret as a consumption gap or income gap when we show the model. So it does tell us about how the current consumption related with expected consumption in the next areas, and it linked with the real interest rates. And the real interest rates, here the difference between the IT non-interest rates and expected PT plus one expected inflation rate in the next areas, and RTM here does natural interest rates, and it's constant. But so here we have the first equation for IS curve, how households maximize the utility problem and thus link the current consumption or spending with the future spending and real interest rates. And then we have the Philip curve that is derived from the households maximize profit problem and under monopolistic competition and sticky price. So here in this equation, we know that PT, that is kind of inflation rate, it is a function of the expected inflation rate in the next areas, and kappa YTQ, so output gap, and here we can see that the current inflation rate is positively correlated with expected inflation rate and also positively correlated with the output gap. And the Taylor rule here is how the central bank they set interest rates, and the central bank they set interest rates IT here based on two main variables, that is the inflation rate and the output gap. And here we have PP and PY is replace the strength of inflation or output gap of the setup of the interest rates. So here is three main equations in the new Keynesian models, and we can see that here we have expected inflation rate, right? And that's why the expected inflation rate or inflation expectation influence all the variables here from output gap, current inflation, and how the central bank sets the interest rates, and how the interest rates here also can influence the expected inflation. Yeah, so let's go in details about what the IS curve. Here the it derives from household utility maximization problems and is subject to the persist constraints. And keep in mind that the maximize utility problem, but it's over lifetime. It's not only for one values, but it's a lifetime maximization problem. And households have preference of smooth consumption and utility from current consumption, and this utility from work. So the more hours they work, the less or the lower levels of satisfaction. And the more they spend, the happier they are. So, and they also have preference on smooth consumption, so that they don't want to have a very volatile consumption path. And the household can set in one parent's bond with the nominal return IT, so IT here also the nominal interface, and the interface set by the central bank, but also as a provisionary interface. And so that is the one parent's bond nominal returns. And the coefficient sigma here measure the coefficient of relative risk, aversion with respect to consumption, and the inverse of sigma here is the intertemporal substitution elasticity between consumption today and consumption tomorrow. And it depends on the magnitude of the level of real interface. So here we can see how the current output here linked with other variables. First, we can see that the current output gap is positively correlated with the expected output gap. So it's because our assumption that the household aim to smooth consumption over time today and tomorrow they will go to a big option. And the current output gap depends negatively on the real interface here, because here we have the minus here. So, and also parameter in macro model is positive. So this are the notation of the variables. We know that all the parameter here is positive. So that's why when we have negative here, it means that the negative link between the current spending with the real interface. And it also reflects the trade-off between the current and future consumption in real term. So if the real interface increase, the setting goes higher return in real term. So that's why it becomes optional to reduce current consumption in favor of higher consumption in the future. So when the interface or the real interface increase, the people will save more today compared to spend more not today. And the real interface RNT here driven by technology shock and between the long run chain output, that we can ignore the actual real interface here. And the point in this course we interested on all these variables of current spending, expected spending, and then with the effect of real interface on the current spending. But here this theoretical model, right? And in our course, we want to see whether when we apply the real data, whether this equation still hold or not. Yeah, that is the point. So now we use some data to test whether theoretical macroeconomic models is working. Yes, so what expression we can learn or can study from these models? First, we want to know how do households or consumers form inflation expectation, right? Because it's appear here, so we are interested in how people form expectation. And our consumer spending is in line with the IS curve or the Euler equation. Whether they're spending here today, tomorrow, and whether it's calculated with the real interface. And what is the estimated level of intertemporal substitution elasticity? So we also can estimate the parameter here as well. If you learn the ESG modeling, then you see that in the papers or in the textbook, they often assume that this one equal one, or in different models they have different parameter. But now we also can estimate directly what is the value of this parameter and how it changes over time. And also it depends on the national context as well. For example, in the Eurozones, we also find that interchannel substitution, here also substantially difference between Germany, France, Spain, for example. So it's important to test and estimate the values of interchannel substitution, right? Yeah, and in the macro models, for those who put on theory, only they just use some parameter from the textbook, or they just use data from the US, for example, because in the US they have more detailed data, and the data is more available. So in many countries, for example, those work in the European countries or in developing countries, but they still apply some parameter from the US data, so it's unreliable, right? So here we also can estimate and learn how to estimate some parameter in the macro model based on some national context. So we can estimate this parameter for each country's levels. If the data is available, for example, we can estimate this parameter for France, Germany, Spain, with the GCP's available consumer expectation, for examples. And in this work, we learn how to do that. Yeah, and we also estimate whether the people they spending decision in line with this equation, and this also the first chapter of my PhD thesis. And yeah, also published in the journals. And we use German data set to test whether household they form expectation and make decision, consumption decision consistent with the Euler equation, and in which condition, and which household they are more likely to make decision in line with the Euler equation. It's not for everyone, just a subset of the sample. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the first topic we do. And for the next equation, that is the Philip curve, that is the link between the current inflation rate with expected inflation, and prepared, and it derived from the firm's profit maximization problem, and under the condition of monopolistic competition and sticky price. So what is sticky price here? What does it mean?
That's the real cost of changing the price.
Yeah, that's yeah.
So when there's so it will take a time before the price is fully adjusted by the firm.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And it's happy the whole price cannot change in daily basis, but it takes some time to change the price level. Yeah. Yeah, and firms they have monopolistic power, and because of that they can set price up to ensure that they have positive profit. And if we remember in the perfect competition, then profit always zero, right? But in this model, with the monopolistic power, the firms they can earn positive profit. And because price are sticky, and because of handling cost, so there's a firms they also have power to set price, but I don't know when and in which conditions they can reset that price, and they do not know when they will be able to change price in the future. So we can assume that, for example, in the sample we have 100 firms in the economy, but we just know that a share of the firm they are able to change the price in this period. For example, the share would be 70% or 80% of the firm they can change price in one period. For example, but yeah, the share of the firm they can change or update their price also change and depends on the macroeconomic condition, right? So it's not the same all the time, and that also interesting point as well. And if we have a long parallel data over time, we can see the frequency of the firm they update the price levels. And for example, now in two scenarios, during this time of high inflation and in time of low inflation, in which environment the firm more likely to update their price and more frequently update their price in time of high inflation or low inflation.
High inflation.
Yeah.
High inflation.
Yeah, because in time of high inflation they are more likely. Yeah, but in time of low inflation or price is stable, stable. Yeah. we try to keep the price remain unchanged, and that's likely to affect the price. Yeah. And then we also can test the link between current inflation rate with expected inflation here and the financial positive correction here, and the current inflation rate also positively correlated with the current output gap, and then we have positive correlation between expected inflation and expected output gap, and we can test whether the curve is hold or not with the data. And then we can study two main questions from the PD curves here. Is how to form inflation expectations, and what are the effects of firm inflation expectation on the increases such as frequency or the likelihood that they update their price, and make other decisions like hiring new employees or expand their business or investment, for example. So with the firm survey data, we can study this question as well. And the next equation and the last equation in the New Keynesian model, the basic New Keynesian model here is the Taylor group. That is how the central bank they set interest rate and nominal interest rate as a function of inflation and output. Yeah. And here we can see that it's both parameter here, as I said, it's positive. So the current inflation rate here is positively correlated with inflation and output gap, right? And then, yeah, the parameter here, PP and PY here also measure the strength of policy relation to inflation and output. And typically, we know that the central bank they care more about inflation compared with the output gap, because the main objective of the central bank is to keep price stability. So they normally put more weight on inflation compared with output gap. But we have a condition here that PP here should be larger one to make the models work. And we don't know why we need the condition that PP must be larger one in the Taylor group. Why PP here should be larger than 1? What happens if PP is smaller than 1?
Because they want to the real interest rate equal to the nominal interest rate minus the inflation. It's like that PP is less than 1, so like the policy interest rate cannot keep up with the inflation.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So if PP is smaller than 1, it means that the change in nominal interest rate cannot keep up with the change in inflation. So, for example, if inflation increased by 1.5 percentage point, for example, but PP here smaller than 1, it means that interest rate here does increase, but less than 1.5 percentage point, right? So the real interest rate here is the difference between the nominal interest rate and expected inflation or inflation level. So the nominal interest rate here still, the change in nominal interest rate is smaller than the change in inflation. So that's why the real interest rate here still decrease. And because real interest rate still decrease, so it's still promote for the economic growth, and it's lead to higher inflation. So that's why the central bank cannot manage inflation levels if PP is smaller than 1. So here we need a condition that PP should be larger than 1. And for PT here, there's a monetary policy shock, and we can ignore it for that. So in this type of equation here, we can test whether people, when they form expectations about interest rates here, is consistent with the Taylor rule. For example, if inflation is going up, whether interest rates here also going up, for example. Or when the output gap here or output increase, where the interest rates here also increase. question to measure how people think about the future interest rates and inflation rate and output gap or economic growth. So based on this equation and this question, we can test whether people understand monetary and policy tailoring. Okay? Yeah. And now we just use data to test some very basic equation in the New Keynesian models. It's a basic equation, but it's a foundation of all the modern macroeconomic models. And we will see that in our data, we reject quite a lot of the prediction from the theoretical models. With some subset of the household, they form the expectation in line with the macroeconomic models. And we will see which household they are more likely to react and to form expectations consistent with the theoretical models. And that is one of the main purpose of our course.
Can I ask
Yeah.
You want to ask do they understand Tailoring, right?
Yeah.
Do they understand what are they who are the people they want? Everyone?
Everyone.
You see, everyone.
Yeah, we can test so because in the surveys we conduct a national survey for the whole population. So for example, we ask 1,000 or 10,000 households in Vietnam, for example, or in Germany.
About Tailoring. I think it's
Not about tailoring, but of course we cannot know that will you understand the tailoring or not, and yes and no, and then we can understand people they understand tailoring, they don't know about tailoring at all. But we ask them about what do you think about interface in West China, what do you think about kind of interest rate or interest rate in the future in West China and economic growth in West China. And then we can see whether the form expectation about interest rate, inflation, and output gap is consistent with the tailoring model. Yeah.
I'm just curious only, like, because at the national level, because like what we're trying to survey and ask a question, but I think it's quite specialized knowledge, right? And when you think about like the overall population, not many people can understand. Like for example, if I don't go to GFE, then I won't understand what is like the different rate of inflation or what is all this is related to. So what if the reason why certain subset of the household they are not consistent with the theory is not because they really systematically behave differently from the theory, but because they just don't understand the question that's being asked to them.
That's a very good question. So here we ask questions just about interest expectation, for example, and we ask question about economic growth and interest expectation, right? And in the models, we assume everyone understands the typical models. For example, when we interpret the monetary policy shocks on household spending, for example, when we have three equations in the New Keynesian model, right? And then we write the input response function about monetary policy shock on household spending, and we assume in that input response function that the household they know the tailoring, right? Because when we show the system of equations like IS curve, 3D curves, and the tailoring, and we have the final result for the impact of monetary policy shock on household spending, right?
Yes.
And in this model, we assume that the household they also understand about tailoring, right?
So the question must be like, do you understand the Taylor rule or not?
No, we cannot answer this kind of question, but we can test it indirectly. So we will ask that, do you understand monetary policy tailoring or not? And then just yes or no in the survey. But we, instead of asking that question, we ask about the content of the tailoring, like interest rate, inflation, and output gap expectation, or output or economic growth expectation, for example. Yeah. And then we see it's consistent with each other. or in the Philip curve, it's a link between inflation and unemployment or economic growth, right? That is the Philip curve. And we can also ask them, do you understand the Philip curves or not? Because they don't know about that. But instead of that, we ask them, what do you think about inflation in the next 12 months? What do you think about unemployment in the next 12 months? And whether it's a positive or negative correlated with this variable to see whether people form expectation is consistent with the Philip curve expectation, right? So exactly that's the point. Here we use the survey data to test some prediction from the macroeconomic theory models, right? So yeah, very good point. Any other questions? Yeah, so we have three main equations in Taylor Room that also play as the foundation for our course about how. And now the point, the next step will be learn how to measure this expectation and how to measure survey data with the theoretical model. Actually, it's very hard to measure 100% correctly from the survey data question with all the variables here. Here, for example, in the Philip curve or in the Taylor rooms here or Museum model, the output gap expectation here or the output gap here, but in the survey we cannot ask what do you expect about the output gap in the next 12 months, right? Because it is a very technical terms, and but instead of that, we just ask about what do you think economic growth in the next 12 months, for example. But we know the correlation between the economic growth and output gap, right, is always positively correlated to each other. So we can use some kind of variable as proxy for the variables in the theoretical model. Okay, so just a little bit about the history of why expectation is important. So in the 1960s and 1970s, there rational expectation revolution in macroeconomic theories, and so they just say that the expectation is important for the macroeconomic models in the 1960s and 1970s, but at the time they don't know how to measure it and how to work with that, but they just assume that expected inflation here or expected price levels here, just BT here, BT and E is expected inflation or expected price level is a function of all the information sets of IT here, the information set. So, and they assume that it's a rational expectation, and rational here, it means that people they have a full set of information that needed for their formation of inflation expectations. But there are no tests and whether the expectation is rational or not. And instead of that, they just use interim variables, that they use the bus of the actual data, like the bus of the realized inflation and the interim variables for the current inflation rate, for example, or expected inflation. But these approaches have a strong assumption regarding to how people form expectation, and it's based on the condition that people have the full set of the information. And its theory is data later review, so that its assumption is wrong, and it's far from already lunch. Yeah, and yeah, it's based on the assumption that how people make or form expectation is fully rational, but it's wrong. We will see later in our data and why it's far from perfect. And what if expectations are not rational? And first, we want to test how people, whether people they form expectation is rational or not. So we will check a few things here, like the accuracies of how they form expectation by the potential the mean absolute forecast errors here. It should be 0, right? Because when we have the, for example, we make a survey of 1,000 people in Vietnam, for example, we ask them what do you think about the current inflation rate in Vietnam, and for example, first, you know what is the current inflation rate in Vietnam at the moment without checking for the data. Yeah. What is the current inflation rate in Vietnam? 7%. Any other ideas?
4.
What is the current inflation rate in Vietnam?
Inflation, I think 4%.
4%. 8%. So 7, 8, 4, and
Yeah, I think it's about 7 to 8%.
7%. And
7%.
7%.
Thưa con mình thôi.
8%. You can just Google and what is the inflation rate? Or last month inflation rate in Vietnam.
Mình cũng chạy theo.
So, how about Google? How much? 6.91. Really?
It is around 3.
Yeah, according to the
3.6 year-over-year.
that is the interest rate in Vietnam.
And you?
Move around 2 or 3% and average less than 4%.
Less than 4%, right? So around 4%. Yeah. So the answer is correct, right? And the only one. And the other is from 7 to 8%. So, for example, in our class, we have 9 students, and one is 4%, and the other from 7 to 8%. So, in survey, we say that it's about 7.5%. Okay? And 7.5, and then we have only 1 4, so now take the average. This should be around 7%. So, it's very far from the current inflation rate at 4%. And actually, it reflects very well with the interest rate. And we see in our main lectures about one of the side effects when we ask people about what is the current inflation rate or expected inflation rate, it often upward bias, right? And it's very much, it's higher than the actual inflation rate.
So can I ask, like, if I just happen, like, so for example, now I expect to 7 or 8%,
Yeah.
but if I just happen to read the news and I know it's like about lesser than 4%,
Yeah.
then does whatever I answer in the questionnaire really truly reflect my expectation, or it's just because I have the knowledge already?
Yeah, yeah. So it's important as well. So it's so the way that people they form expectation or perception about current inflation rate is a sum of everything, a sum of your experience, and also some of the news you read, right? And the lifetime experience or in the society you live, and the friends and everything. And make the, and then to combine all those information sets, and then to have a number. And we can study what is the role of the news you read, and the role of education you have, and financial literacy, and also the lifetime experience, as well how to influence the level of inflation expectation. Yeah. And in this course, you will see the different factors, how different factors can have influence or impact on the level of inflation expectation. Right? But the question is a very good reason. And back to the point about the accuracy. the absolute forecast errors here should be zero, but now we can see that it's significantly different from zero, right? And it's positive. And if the condition here, accuracy here, and if this condition is held, or the mean of absolute forecast error here close to zero, it means that the actual inflation rate is 4%, and some of you can answer at 2%, and some of you answer in 6%, for example, and average, we have about 4%, so the mean forecast error is to be zero, but when we use data and test, we find that this condition is failed. It's not only in our student here in our course, but in many other data sets, they also check and test, and they find out this condition is failed.
So we just check for the two metrics, the absolute forecast errors and weakness rate, and then we categorize them into common, accurate, and inaccurate.
Yeah. So we can calculate the forecast error. We can make the forecast errors here. For example, if we ask about two things, so the forecast errors, when we talk about the forecast, we can talk about the next month. And for example, today I ask you what you think about inflation rate in the next month, and then I have to wait for the next month, right, to see the realized inflation rate and compare what you expected today with what happens actually happened in the next month, and then the difference here is the forecast error. But I can check right now, but I have to wait until next year to check whether the forecast error is correct or not, right? And but when we have hard data from the history, for example, we already surveyed last year or last 2 years, we can check whether the forecast is correct or not, and how far from the truth value number. But we ask about what to think about the current inflation rate, for example. So in this case, we can test immediately what is the perception error, right? So the perception about the current levels of inflation is close to the actual or the current actual inflation rate. And the second condition here, the unbiased mix, we got into the equation here. The estimated inflation, the current inflation rate, is a function of the expected inflation in the past term from the past term. So, and then in this condition, we just set the current inflation rate here on the level of inflation for the last term. So, in that way, we test that the condition by just estimate the current inflation rate from realized inflation from what we expected from the last term. And in this great condition, we just estimate the OLF regression on this one. And in this case, we can expect that alpha is 0 and beta is 1, right? Because in this case, what we expected from the last term is exactly with the current inflation rate. That is the idea of rational expectation. And rational, it means that what we expected today, exactly what will happen in next term. But when we test the condition, it also failed as well. And the last point here, we have efficiency, and here we check whether the expectation incorporate all relevant information by regressing inflation errors on a set of lag determinants and testing whether these are significant. So all the lag determinants of the current inflation rate, like economic growth or unemployment or all the macro variables that we can use to check and whether the current inflation expectation is the users the set the information to forecast the inflation rate. And again, when people they use data to test all these information, they find that most of the case they are failed. And they also have some papers to test these things. But there's a very simple test about the rationality of expectation.
Can I ask more about the efficiency part? And
idea, yeah, because the idea of the fully rational expectation, it means that people they base on when they form expectation, they have and they have also informed success. Like for example, if you think about inflation, so now let's think about you are as an economist to forecast inflation. Which information you need to have?
About inflation.
Just in order to make a good forecast about inflation, which information you need to as input for the forecast?
Investment from the government investment from foreign investors. The cost, the change in the price.
Yeah, so for example, we need to know about economic growth, right? Unemployment rate, and even exchanges levels as well for some countries, and also the past info, the historical data set about the inflation rate as well, right? So based on all set the information here, it's important to determine or to help us to make a forecast about future inflation. But yeah, when they test when people when they form expectation based on all set the information here, they verify that this is still all the relevant information here just play very small role on how people form expectation. Yeah, so it's not account for 90% or 80% of the explaining the variation of how people form expectation. It does account for maybe just 5% or 10% of how people form expectation about inflation. It means that people, when they form expectation, is not mainly based on some macroeconomic variables or news variable. It also there's some relevant, some irrational factors on how they form expectation. So it's not efficiency because all the condition here is the determinant of the rationality. So the rational expectation is mean that you make the forecast correctly without any bias or also efficient because you use all the you make use of all the input information.
So if these are significant,
Yeah.
so it will be efficient or inefficient?
Yeah, efficient.
Efficient.
Yeah.
So here to disregard the rational expectation,
Yeah.
do we require all the three criteria to be rejected, both accuracy, unbiased, and efficiency, or?
Yeah, actually it should fulfill all the requirements here. But if it fail only one of three conditions, it means that also is the people is not rational. Yes. So when the people they check for the fully rational, the full rationality, and they find that it's failed, and then they think about an alternative models of expectation. So because of sticky information, it means that the people are not fully rational but partly rational. So it means that they, for example, here the expected inflation or price levels here is a full set of the information in the past. But now they just a subset of the information, some parameters here, they add some friction. For example, now I do not use 100% information set, but maybe only 80% or 90% or 60% only because that's all the information I have. So they have some sticky information, but people just relies on some set of the information, and it's partly rational. Or they also have some rational inattention because if I pay attention to all the information set, it's also very costly, right? Because I have to look at the news about different topic, and it's costly. It's not only about time, but also how I process the information, how I interpret the information, and it's also very costly. So that's why people they also have rational inattention. I decide it's optimal for me to ignore some set of the information, right? And they have the rational inattention, and that is how inflation set here is based on some models that they have some cost for the marginal cost for attention to some type use, and and then they also have some heterogeneous expectation about rationality. It's just again about Berkeley and rationals.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just curious only. Before we know that we can use microsurvey data to test whether our, say, ESG model or the people actually follow rational expectation.
Yeah.
Let's say after testing it and we see, okay, people are not 100%,
Question.
form their expectation rationally.
Yeah.
So now we update our model. I'm just curious only, and say we use a new kind of like modeling technique like stick information, for example.
Yeah.
But once we update our model, is there I'm just curious, is there still a way for us to use microdata to see whether our new updated model still, like people still form their expectation that way?
Yeah. Exactly. So
It's possible, right?
yeah, it's possible. Yeah. So but actually it's just yeah. So they still stay at the state of the literature so far. They just find some theoretical models about the rational inattention, and they just have some empirical test for the rational inattention, but it's not a fully test about the rational inattention. But they just find some evidence for the rational inattention. Yeah. That's possible with the survey data to test that as well. Yeah, for example, they provide some set information and they ask people how much you willing to pay to get some kind of information. For example, now they do an experiment like this one. Now I would like to ask you about future inflation, or I want to ask you to make a predict about future inflation, and here I have some set of the information like the current inflation rate or the historical inflation rate and economic growth, for examples, and then I also have some price for type information. For example, if you want to have the current inflation rate, you have to pay $1, for example, and if you want to have information on economic growth, you pay for also $1, for example. And they have different price for that, and then they ask you which type of information you want to have and how much you're willing to pay to have such kind of information. And that's why they can measure the rational inattention, because the information set here is costly. Right? And that also possible with some experiment as well. Yeah, so they do a series of experiments in the lab, and that they can test some connection of the rational inattention, because the information set is costly. And they also can study who are more willing to pay to get the information set, for example, the different level of financial literacies and education, and whether you want to buy a house or not, and then how much you're willing to pay to get the information.
So can have like rational intention is like we will divide the information set into two things, the thing that we care about, which is like our attention towards it,
Yeah,
and the things that we don't care about, we
Yeah.
consider it to be noise.
Yeah.
And there will be an optimal
yeah,
rational ratio between them.
yeah, exactly.
Very interesting.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Wow.
Yeah. That is how the typical models they develop over time. So first they assume that everyone has a rational expectation, and then they find out the fully rational expectation is something unreliable, so they revise model with some rational inattention or just partly rational. Yeah. So now we talk about the link between the macro expectations and monetary policy, and how the central bank and why the central bank they care about inflation expectations. Yeah, so we know that actual inflation now is a function of inflation expectation. If the people are forward-looking, because for sure that people are forward-looking at least to some degree, and if the people are forward-looking, the current inflation rate or the actual inflation rate actually is a positive function of expected inflation. So it will be easier to target inflation if expectations are less dispersed or less disagreement. If the people expectation is very volatile and very heterogeneous, it's very hard for central bank to move also everyone expectation come to the target of the central bank, right? So if the expectation is less dispersed, so it means that it's in this case it's easier for the central bank to target the interest rate at 2%. So we need to measure the level of dispersion and disagreement among the households in the population. And if the inflation expectations are anchored or it's very close to the target of the central bank, so in this case, monetary policy can stabilize the economy in the short run without risking the medium-term price stability, and that's why it's important for central bank stability and communication, and that's why it's very costly for the central bank to keep the inflation rate at the target. And this is also very important during the time of the. This is what can do. Yes, what does it mean?
Zero low bound.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a zero low bound. After the global financial crisis, many advanced economy they reduce interest rate or policy interest rate at zero to promote the economy and also to have the financial system stabilized. So, and in this case, the zero low bound would mean that the central bank they cannot low interest rates below zero, right? And we know that the real interest rate here is a function of the nominal interest rate and expected inflation. And if the nominal interest rate here is fixed at zero, right? So the only case that the central bank can the only way that the central bank can change the real interest rate is by the change in expected inflation, right? So that's why after the global financial crisis, the way that the central bank they adjust the real interest rates here mainly by the change in the expected inflation, and that's why we have forward guiding monetary policy during the zero low bound. They talk about the future monetary policy and how they conduct monetary policy to support the economy, and because that they aim to change expected inflation levels, and because that they can change the real interest rate when the policy rate is fixed at zero or unchanged. And also that's why the topic about expected inflation here become popular during after the global financial crisis and it's a very new topic in macro from around 2010 until now, and that's why it's very hot topic in the current days over for history. I think it's about 10 years to 15 years after the financial crisis, and the people they care more about expected inflation and whether the forward guiding monetary policy actually works in this scenario or not. And before the zero bound, no one care about expected inflation too much because they can change the nominal interest rate to have impacts on the real interest rate. But when the nominal interest rate here is fixed or cannot change anymore, they care more about expected inflation. But now after the time the zero bound, but the economy now faced with high inflation pairs, and the central bank now they care about expected inflation, and the main reason they care about expected inflation in the moment because they want to anchor the expectation at the target of the central bank. Yeah.
Sorry, Professor. Like when we say like it's easier to target inflation if the expectations are less dispersed, right?
Yeah.
So in that final equation where the real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus inflation expectation,
Yeah.
the inflation expectation is viewed as a point estimate, or is it like a whole range of different values?
Yeah, that's also a very good point. But in this model, this equation does not assume that it's a point forecast. Yeah. Or even that if the people can have a whole range or maybe in a range from my expectation of inflation from 3 to 5, for example, we assume that 3 to 5 of the mean is at 4%. Yeah, just to make the equation here is easier to interpret. Yeah. But later, we also study about the impact of the uncertainty regarding to this point as well. How the uncertainty about expected inflation also have impact on the real interest rate and spending as well. So the central bank communication also can change to the uncertainty of inflation levels. And when the uncertainty about inflation levels is reduced, they also can promote the high level of spending. So yeah, we measure both the point forecast and also the uncertainty regarding to their forecast as well. So yeah, we work on the point forecast and the uncertainty and the range of expectation and how it impacts on the economic behavior both from the firm side and the household side. And that actually the topic we present as a discussion in the exercise for the assignment. Yeah, I did calculation of that. But yeah, that's why you mentioned it's very important. Okay, so now the next step is the use of survey data. We talked quite a lot about the importance and the role of market expectation in macro models. But now it's how to use survey data to address this question. But first, we need to know how to measure the variable first, right? So, for example, how to measure inflation expectation. For example, here we have two ways to measure expectation here. We have quantitative expectation and quantitative expectation. For quantitative expectation here, we can ask during the next term, will the price in general will go up or go down or stay where they are now, so up, down or stay the same. So that's the qualitative and the directional of the effect. So that's why we call that the quantitative expectation. And the quantitative expectation here, we ask about what percent do you expect price to go up, down, on average during the next term, and then you just provide the numbers here. Yeah. And first for these two questions, we think that which question is the easier for people to answer?
First one.
The first one, right? It's obviously you can see that the first one is easier for people to answer, and the second one is harder and it's more challenging for people to answer. But what is so the advantage of this question is easier to answer, but what is the disadvantage of this question?
You can't quantify by how much.
Yeah, it's very hard to quantify the magnitude of the effect, right? And also, different people can have different views about what that means about go up or go down or stay the same, where it's go up but very little. Some people they also think that if it go up slightly, we can assume that it also stay the same, for example. So maybe different people can have different views about the same things. But some people just go up slightly, they also think that it's going up, right? But some people they think that it's going up slightly And even that, if we have a 5 category here, for example, go up significantly and go up slightly, stay the same, go down slightly and go down significantly. But again, different people can interpret the question differently because how much is a slightly and how much is significantly, for example, right? So the quality here, we have the advantage of very easy to answer, but the most of this question is that different people can hold differently, and just to comment that it's harder to quantify the magnitude of the effect.
Can I ask, like, I think it is a bit too general of a question for me.
Yeah.
It is very like simple to ask everyone with different education level. But like for example, like what are prices in general? Because like there are things that I expected to be the prices to go up, there are things that I expected to go down.
Yeah.
So how can I answer this one? I'm pretty confused. Yeah. But and like for example, with the electric devices such as laptop, normally the price will not go up, or maybe it go up, but like the quality is much better.
Yeah.
The cheap is become much cheaper. So how can I like answer this one? Because it's not prices in general.
Yeah. That's again very good point regarding to the wording of the question. Whether we ask likely do you think inflation will go up now or stay the same, right? Or we ask inflation and the price in general, because in economic theory, in principle, the definition of inflation, that is the level of inflation is how much price in general will increase or decrease, right? So that's why we can ask a price in general as a in term to talk about inflation. But why in the Michigan survey of consumers here is obvious, and I think one of the most famous survey data about expectation, and they ask price in general instead of inflation because not many people understand what inflation, what does it mean, because inflation is in terms of it's a technical term. So that's why they just use the price in general, just to mention that it's the price of everything. So it's not only in one item, but the price in general, and it's also consistent with the textbook definition of inflation. Yeah.
Yeah, for me, I also do agree. I do also feel like if you ask inflation is maybe a bit challenging for some people to digest the question, but I think the other point is I also feel there's something like not 100% feel right, because say for example, if this questionnaire is administered to like a housewife,
Yeah.
and then my whole life is I just go to the grocery,
Yeah.
right, and then as an economist, I understand that inflation, there are different good basket.
Yeah.
So if you ask that question to a housewife, of course, they will refer to like diapers, like food and grocery. But if you ask that question to different person, then they will refer to different basket, right?
Yeah.
So how can we ensure that overall it still refer to like the one thing that we want to find out is inflation?
Yeah. That's again very good point. And we see in the papers and some application about how to measure inflation expectation and the determinants of inflation expectation and how the formation of inflation expectation, the role of life experience, and also how much and how frequency you go to the shopping and the grocery market, for example, and why the male and female very different views about future inflation. And in the literature and in studies, we also look at such kind of dimension. Yeah, we will see in the data later. Yeah, that's why it's a and now just think that here the very starting point of how to measure expectation and how to measure inflation expectation. And let's think like this. if we want to measure this thing, but for very details and for different purpose, so the questionnaire will be very long and complicated, right? That's why we have to explain what we mean about price in general, right? And actually in some survey and in recent survey, for example, the survey in Spain, they also have explanation about what does it mean about inflation. So the price in general and compared with to the past term, for example. And in some survey, they also give some more explanation with the price in general, and they give some examples about what is the price in general. For example, it's not only grocery, but also gasolines or some durable goods, for example. So it's still in the development of the questionnaires and the aim here is that how to measure exactly what we want to measure. That is inflation in general. And it's still a hot topic at the moment. And the people still try to find what is the best way to measure inflation expectation from the household. Yeah. And you will see in the topic, so this question is just one of the examples, but the people, even at the moment, so it's a current state, people still trying to develop the question to better measure of inflation expectation. And we will see in our course here the same question here or similar to this one, but we have many different versions.
Yes, well, just one more question. I think like if it is irrelevant, so you can skip it. And the second question is about like quantitative expectations. You asked about like percent, but I just remember this Michigan is in America, right?
Yeah.
So it tested the people in the U.S. So I remember reading somewhere that a very large percent of the U.S. people are not very good with math, and not just like advanced math, but in basic math, and they have problems with percentage. Yeah, we studied that in household finance course as well.
Yeah.
So how can we control whether they understand it well or not? For example, they think like 100%. They just think randomly because like it sounds perfect for them.
Yeah, so this afternoon when we look at the New York Fed survey consumer expectation, and in that survey they also have one or two questions to measure the numerical ability, how we can interpret the percentage point. And so one of numerical ability on the formation of expectation. And we also find out in the US survey data, the outlier also much larger than compared with German survey data, for example. Yeah. And one more thing, also very important here, is that if we just add the percent here, but if people they don't know, right? They also have enough options that I don't know here as well. So here I solve it, but actually in most of the survey for this question we also have options that I don't know. Yep. And our question here is that why we need the I don't know here? Why we need the option I don't know? What's the problem if we exclude the I don't know option here? For example, we just put this one and another version we have the option that I don't know. So what's the problem if we exclude the option I don't know?
Exclude.
They will just pick randomly the other three options and basically still do so.
Yeah, exactly. So if we don't have the option I don't know here, and I don't know about where up, down, or stay the same, right? So it means that I just randomly select one of three, right? So it means that in this way, if I survey 4,000 people, I get the full sample of 4,000 answers. But my data become very noisy, right? Because this become a lot of randoms and we cannot analyze kind of data. But so it's better to include the options that I don't know. But it's also very costly. You know why it's costly if you have the option I don't know here?
We have to exclude one of the observations and
Yeah, exactly. So if we survey 4,000 households and maybe 50% they say that I don't know. it means that we only data for we have data for only 50% of the sample, and it's costly, right? Because at the end of the day, we want to see the impact of inflation expectation on some outcome variables, for example. But if 50% of the sample, they say that I don't know, and then it means that we have only 50%. And actually, in my data, for example, when we conduct a survey in Germany, we find that this have about 30% or 40% of the sample, they say that I don't know. Regarding to, for example, inflation rate or expected inflation. And we also find that the share people they answer the quality question here is much higher than the share people they can answer this question or they provide the number here. But yeah, it's costly to include the I don't know here, and it's very painful as well, but actually it's very important to include the I don't know option. Some people they just want to have a full sample set, and they exclude the option I don't know. But yeah, it's a bad practice, and it's we should not follow. Okay. Yeah, and then because this question is difficult, right? And they also can provide some hints for people to answer. For example, they instead of open-end question with percent here with any guidance, they also can provide some hint like from -1 to 0% or 0 to 1 or 1 to 2%, for example, so that people can choose different hint. So it also another way to measure expectation. But the problem with this measure is that it's because we already provide some number for people to select already. So yeah, it also have a problem of framing or anchoring. But yeah, it also another way to improve the people, to make it easier for people to answer. And we also can ask, we provide the different hints, and then we ask people to pick the probability distribution of expectation on different hints. For example, I have a range of hints here from -1% to 2%, for example, and I ask people to pick how much percent of the likelihood to think inflation will be in different hints, and the sum of the probability here should be 100%. So people can, for example, we have only 3 bits here, and someone can put 50% here, 20% here, and 30% here, for example. And based on this question, we still can measure the weighted average inflation rate, and also the weighted average standard deviation to measure the uncertainty as well. And see that when we look at the survey data, we also can see the impact on different way to measure this one. And we can see that different verdict regarding to price in general or inflation rate, as you just mentioned, because this factor is also important factors. Yeah. And in this topic, we just to highlight one more time regarding to the aim about cost. We focus on the question, but in the survey question, but it's relevant for monetary macroeconomics. And the literature surveys analyze the subjective survey data because when we ask people about what do you think about inflation or future inflation or perception of inflation, if a subjective measurement is not objective, right? Because we don't have any test for that, but it's a subjective measurement. But we also have an objective measurement, like if we ask about gender, education, income, age, or family background, wealth, employment is the objective measurement because there is no behavior question here, just about some fact. But here we ask about the subjective measurement. And one of the important factors here is that if we want to measure how people form expectation or perception, So the subjective measurement, we should have one sentence in the introduction of the survey that we just care about the opinions and no right or wrong answer, right? So because if we just or we want to emphasize that we want to, for example, if I ask you what do you think about inflation rate in the next 12 months, but if I ask you to make the best forecast as possible, so in this case, it's more likely that you will go and check for the Google, right? And I don't want to do that because if everyone check for the Google, the thing is that we have very consensus answer, right? So everyone will give me one number, and it's very similar number. Or if I ask you what do you think about current inflation rate, and everyone check Google, so you have come up with the same number, that about 4%, right? So I don't want to do and make such kind of situation, and just want to ask what do you think about current inflation rate, because I want to study the behavior aspect. So at the opening of the survey, we often have question or question, but the introduction that we just care about the opinions and right or wrong, and so just provide the opinions, and it's important for us. And this provides the best efforts. Yeah, we will see with the survey data and with the actual questionnaire, and I will show you the topic about that. Yeah. Yeah, and in this course we also look at a little bit about professional forecasters, households, and home, and mainly focus on the households because we want to study behavioral macroeconomics. And many data in the qualitative but also quantitative we will see. And some random survey data that we will see in the next pictures. And the next topic is that why survey micro data interesting for macroeconomics. So yeah, based on the survey data, we can address many interesting questions. For example, we can study the heterogeneity because this is a micro survey data. We ask about demographic like age, income, education, financial aptitudes, about many different things, right? So that's why we can study about the heterogeneity, how different income levels of financial literacy, education, or lifetime experience as well, how it impacts or influence the level of inflation expectation. Yeah. And yeah, so it's about heterogeneity of formation of inflation expectation. And we also study about this agreement, because with the survey data, with thousands of people, and over time, we can study and measure this agreement by the measure of standardization or interquartile from the population, for example, and the forecast accuracy, because we can compare how they forecast today compared with the realized inflation in the future. And actually last year, when I first time did this course, and I conduct a survey of students in our course, here also 10 students, about what they think about inflation in the next 12 months in exactly in this point of time. So maybe tomorrow I will open the data for you to see how the people from last year expect inflation in the next 12 months, and then we can compare with the actual data to see the forecast error. And so last year I conducted 2 surveys, the same question, but I also asked a student in the Jialing University and a master's student here last year, and I have an Excel file for the data set, and I will send you the Excel file as well, and maybe you can study about the forecast error for last year compared with the realized inflation at this point of time, exactly 1 year ago, and how much is the agreement over time. Yeah, so this agreement here, and we also can study the impact of monetary policy on the degree of this agreement over time. formation of expectation here, we also can use micro data, panel data to study quick micro models for the formation of expectation, and whether people form expectation is a
Change
close
over
and
time.
angle to the level of the central bank time, and how it changes over time. And the next question we can study about whether the people they make economic decisions in line with their expectation or inflation expectation, whether consumption, spending, saving, behavior consistent with the level of their expectation about inflation, whether consistent with the IS curve, for example. And the same thing for the phones. And the last point regarding to central bank communication, where the central bank can use communication as a monetary policy tool. So the way the people and the house, the central bank, they communicate with the public, where the people they can understand the message from the central banks, and what is the share people they pay attention to the central bank news, for example, to see the effectiveness of central bank communication with the general population. And in the survey, we also have questions to mention how much the people they pay attention to the central bank news. For example, they ask over the past 12 months or over the past month, did you hear any news from the ECB, for example? And yes, no, and we can share how much people they pay attention to the news about the ECB. And then they also have, if the answer is yes, they also have a next question asking whether which type of or which channel you use from ECB, whether it's going through social media or newspaper or radio or TV. Yeah. And we also can see who are more likely to pay attention or the news from the ECB through social media, for example, compared with the population. Yeah, so all the questions here, or most of these questions, we can use survey data to address. And this also some suggestion for you for the term paper as well. You can base on this suggestion to form your own question when we have the data, right? So in today, in this afternoon, I will show you with the new job test survey data, and tomorrow I will introduce ECB survey approach expectation, so that you can see how much or how many questions from this thing we can use the survey, the available survey data set to answer. And just here, just some examples, and you can base on these examples to develop your own question as well. So just use this question as a guidelines or suggestion, and you are free to modify it and make it differently. So just look at this question to form your own question for your term paper, okay? And then we also can study, later we study about the survey experiment design. So it's not only, for example, the question about whether people they make economic decision consistent with the level of inflation expectation. We can design the survey experiment to study this question as well, to study the causal effect of inflation expectation on economic decisions. Or we can test the question about the central bank communication, the information from the central bank, how it can influence the level of inflation expectation of the households. That's also another way to, and with the survey experiment and available data set, you can do either one of the two approaches. There are some other fields of economics using survey data that is not covered in our course, but it's still possible for you to do as well. For example, in labor economics, they also use survey data quite a lot to study about risk dynamic or family economics or structures in the labor market or informs decisions about micro data level setting. But in this course we do not cover this topic because the data for this subject is very limited. So that's why it's very hard for us, especially for our course, for master students to have access on this data set. So that's why we exclude this topic from our course. But later when you do PhD, for example, or after PhD, the likelihood that you can access to this kind of data is higher, and then I think it's possible to study about micro data to set price levels. And also the last one we have to use also decision like portfolio choice or stock market decisions. We also can use survey data to study as well. But in this course we just focus on monetary macro rather than the household finance. But if you already studied with Professor Hayasos, right? So he also used quite a lot of survey data and to understand the question why so little people, also just a few people that invest in stock market. Yeah, that is the question in this research and also use the survey data. But in this course we focus more about the expectation formation and how macro expectation influence the economic decision and the role of central bank communication. Yeah, also. Information. Okay, so we can make a break here
Yeah.
for 10 minutes.